Hello, welcome to a new 302 on March 4th, 2021. I hope everybody is well today. So today we have a relatively broad arc in a certain sense to cover off. Because the focus of our conversation, I suppose, it's not a broad arc, it's a big straight line. Because the focus of our conversation is Syzygy. Syzygy. This is one of these truly great words, right? Truly great. Looks good on the page, fun to pronounce, interesting meaning, has frankly a lot of utility. You can use it to do our work. Syzygy. So what's Syzygy? Syzygy in its primary usage, right, is an astronomical or an astrological term. And is sort of the alignment of bodies. So, you have the sun and the earth and the moon going around the earth. And when those three things line up, Syzygy. So you generally have Syzygy anytime that you have an eclipse, for instance. But you can have it under other conditions, sun, moon, and earth lining up. Now, when we're talking about Syzygy in a Jungian context, right, we're talking about Jung's specific sort of usage of that idea around the male and female parts of the psyche, right? And there has been a lot of discussion in this class and tremendous discussion from you guys about challenging some of those models, right? Challenging some of those models, what the utility of those models is, how categorical they are, how much we need to push on the specifics of those original models. This is good. These are active questions, things that need to be think about, things that need to be thought about. Yeah, they need to be think about. But of course, in the specific usage that Jung is making of them, there is a sense in which Jung himself held very strongly, right? This kind of core idea, which I think is the sort of central place and tells you a little something about the goal state, as it were. And that is, I am a man and I am a woman. I am a man and I am a woman. Try saying that. Try saying it a bunch. Or, if you have a primary identification, start there, right? So, I am a woman and I am a man. I am a man and I am a woman. This is the starting point, in a way, but it's also the ending point. And this is, in a sense, what Syzygy is about. That connection, that unity. It is in some ways, of course, a coincidence of opposites. It's in some sense an operation of the transcendent function. It's in some sense an integration. It's all these things. But there is a particular and special place in the system for this, as indeed there is a particular and special place in, sort of the mythological and fairy tale and alchemical and dream material that people brought in around this, right? A specific and particular charge around the particular opposition that is expressed and then unified in this particular question. Pause there for a second. And it isn't so much that I've lost my train of thought. It's just that now that I had to pause for a second to do something else, I don't remember where I am in my train of thought. So you're going to get a very early recap. Syzygy, the alignment of planets, the inner question of the male and female and the union of those figures that we see in sort of myth and in alchemy and in dream and so on and so forth, those specific formulations. I don't remember if I covered more than that. So the answer is I'm going to keep going. Because actually the first thing that I want to talk about, and this is related, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So some of you will be familiar with this, the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's relatively recent. It is a proposed kind of cognitive bias. There is some experimental evidence for it, but I don't know that it has sort of universal acceptance. But nevertheless, the evidence is pretty good. So, you know, the Dunning-Kruger effect is the basic effect that people who have low ability in an area sort of systematically overestimate their ability. And that shows up in a variety of ways. So people who have low information, for instance, in a subject, often substantially overestimate how much they know about it. People who have sort of low familiarity with a subject, sort of underestimate the complexity of the subject. So people with low ability, right, or low knowledge, both, in an area tend to overestimate their ability. Now, this is something that's very, very easy to detect. You know, as we've discussed, virtually everybody has that uncle. I'm saying uncle, that's maybe very slightly unfair, but you know, it seems like it's an uncle more often, but everybody's got that person. Everybody knows that person, maybe not even necessarily a relative, but that person who sort of holds forth on things that they do not in fact know about, right? And when you talk to these people, I mean, sort of think to your interactions with people that are sort of holding forth. And because it is proposed to be a, you know, a universal bias, you know, it can be the case that people, of course, do have a high degree of knowledge and ability in some area. And thus what they overestimate is their knowledge and ability in some other area, right? That they're quite knowledgeable in one area and they sort of hold forth in another. This is something I occasionally see, I add, with certain popularizers of science. Every now and then I see this with certain popularizers of science that, of course, they're quite knowledgeable in whatever their scientific area is. But when it comes to questions of philosophy, they are like radically uninformed, right? They'll sort of sweep that stuff aside with a hand and say, "Wow, that's nonsense," which, you know, seems to indicate that their notion of philosophy is primarily like vested in like an image of people with a beret in a French cafe scowling over small cups of espresso and talking about death. You know, some philosophy is that. Some of the best parts of philosophy are that. But you know, nevertheless, right, there is this kind of like dismissal of things, and yet they're described in somewhat blunt terms. One sees this, quite frankly, even with people who are sort of declared enemies of certain things. So it's not uncommon, for instance, to see very fierce opponents of religion have what seem like fairly profound lacks in their approach and understanding, right? Which is to say that in finding the subject sort of, you know, despicable and dismissible and beneath notice, they sort of haven't bothered to absorb the subtleties and variations and nuances, and right, you know, they don't like it. So, you know, so you don't tend to develop a particularly fine and nuanced appreciation of wine if you insist on spitting it out every time somebody serves it. Although you do spit it out at a tasting course, so I may be wrong there. Or at the very least, my metaphor may not be quite as apt as I'd hoped. Well, point being, think to someone who you have spoken with who has a really easily identifiable instance of Dunning-Kruger, right? Somebody who you have spoken with and you think, like, wow, you really don't know. You really don't know about this, but you really believe you do. I'm sure you can think of such an instance, okay? Now, what's interesting about those instances when we consider it, okay, from the perspective that we're going to consider it, I mean, it's interesting that that's a universal. So we'll get to the fact that you too, almost by necessity, have such fields, right? And typically what those fields are going to fall into the unknown for you. That is to say that it's going to be areas of shortfall that are outside your awareness, right? So you don't know. don't know where you're sort of overestimating in places. Although generally, if you sort of search your mind and you look for places where you have extremely simplified versions of things, well, that's not that complex. Or if you dismiss something as stupid, that's often actually a really clear indication. Individual things may, in fact, be quite stupid. And from a certain perspective, most human endeavor is kind of stupid. But you know, stupid in terms of like, that's sort of pointless, or this particular field of inquiry is pointless, right? That's often a place where it is the case that, you know, you may be expressing this. But forget that for a minute. Just think about somebody else. Think about somebody where you've seen a really clear case. Now, what's interesting about this is that the material that they express, when they express it, if you allow them to hold forth, right, or if you draw forth what their take is, right, allow them to talk, allow them to fill the space, or allow them to, right, if they have the inclination, to hold forth and fill the space with their thoughts on the subject, their ideas on the subject, their feelings on the subject. By and large, you're not learning about the subject. You're learning about them. And that, in a way, should be pretty obvious, right? Of course you're learning about them. They don't know about the subject. So by necessity, right, the lion's share of what they produce has to be, in fact, them, not the subject. Now, of course, there may be elements of the subject, and you may be picking up, you know, elements of things that they do have knowledge on, they do have a connection with. They may be processing one thing in terms of another thing, right? So it's not uncommon for people to do that. I have often made the joke, right? That is like every discipline will claim that it's the master discipline. The difference is, of course, that cognitive science is the master discipline, right? This is a joke that I make about its interdisciplinarity. You know, and this is somewhat true, right? Every discipline at some level believes that it is the master discipline, right? It believes that it is the fundamental discipline, the fundamental science, the most important level at which we should be looking, because why else would people go into it, right? It's like asking the question, you know, when you look at a story, it's like, well, why are we paying attention to this person, you know? And the answer is because this person is the most important person for the story, like, right? They're the most important person in the story. Otherwise, we wouldn't be paying attention to them. That's what stories are, mostly. Conventional stories. So, you know, people go into the fields typically that they feel are the fields that are sort of the most important, right? At some level, the master field, right? And you'll get lots of interesting things where people will sort of run an analysis of human knowledge, which is filtered through the particularities of their field, right? So The Economist, it's like everything really is about transaction, right? All of nature can be expressed in transaction, you know, or the physicist who's like, you know, really, if you consider it, everything is just, you know, an afterthought to quantum phenomena, or, right? This is the sort of thing, or, you know, psychology, and particularly in its depth formulation, which in its really strong versions is like all human sciences are actually footnotes to psychology, because ultimately everything is being filtered through psychology, right? Your mind is the field of all experience, right? The categories in a Kantian sense itself, and therefore, right, all of our sciences are actually about psychology. This seems like a kind of a strong position. I think most of us believe that at some level we are able to learn about things that are in some sense occurring outside of us. Some of you may be hard idealists, I don't know. But the point is, right, every discipline's kind of got this, you know, at some level it's got its sort of fanatics who think that you can view everything in those terms. I add that, as with most forms of mental flexibility, I actually don't think this is necessarily bad, provided that you cultivate more than one of these, right? So if you can move into the position where you can think of each discipline as being the master discipline, right, and think about it in those terms and then shift away from it, it's a good exercise, to be perfectly honest, for developing a certain kind of, you know, multipolar polytheistic mind. Very good for depth work, very good for archetypal work, is to sort of, you know, view everything from that far edge perspective. You know, what does the world look like if the most fundamental discipline is, you know, genetics? What does the world look like if the most fundamental discipline is literature? What does the world look like if the most fundamental discipline is philosophy? What does the world look like if the most fundamental position and discipline is math? What does it look like if the most fundamental position is economics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, so my point relative to Dunning-Kruger is that people may have knowledge and thus sort of transfer their understanding of the way things work in one discipline to another discipline so that their ideas aren't completely uninformed, but nevertheless, right, they don't know about it. So because they don't know about it and they don't have skill, they're filling the gap with their mind, which is to say they're filling the gap with projections. That's what it is. It's projections. And you can learn a great deal, frankly, from talking to somebody about something about which they do not know. You can learn a great deal, not about that subject, but about their mind. And if you do this enough times, and this is sort of the point, right? Dunning-Kruger gets a name, an effect name, because it's a thing that happens across, apparently universally, but at the very least across large numbers of people. This is not a bizarre and idiosyncratic and isolated human event. It's a thing that happens all over the place. Right? It's a thing that happens for all of us. It seems to be fundamental to the way that our cognition works, that we overestimate our knowledge in areas that we have low knowledge and overestimate our ability in areas that we have low ability, which is interesting. Again, sort of following on a mention that I made last week, it seems to be a little bit of leftover intimation of omnipotence, right? So the sort of idea of omnipotence that we have as infants, fades by degrees. And so the least developed places in us, the places that are really still infants, tend to also, of course, carry with them this inflated sense of omnipotence, right? These are the aspects that have never actually separated out from the unconscious, so they have no business integrating with anything. They haven't been differentiated at all. So Dunning-Kruger. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing it up specifically to pay attention to the way that necessarily projection is happening there, right? Whatever they're saying, what they're actually telling you about is their mind. They're not talking about the subject. They can't be. They don't know about it, right? Now, our mind loves filling gaps. It's something it does very well. If you've ever had a fascination with, visual illusions, right? That kind of thing, the, visual illusions and the kind of, tricks that you find in psych and perception textbooks, or that you get in weird Ripley's Believe It or Not books when you're a kid. You'll know that our mind sort of delights in projecting pattern where there isn't necessarily pattern, right? All those classic cases. And, this is pretty obvious to us in some cases, right? It has taken a very fine-tuned and rapid-fire precision science of perception to pick up some of this. So, for instance, to know that the actual data of our perception is quite spotty and our mind is projecting into the gaps, that is, that's something that's only become sort of obvious at that level in the modern era as we've had modern psychology. So, we sort of know now that we have a blind spot. And why do we have a blind spot? Because this bundle of optic nerve is jutting out of our receptor field in our eyeball. But look around, you don't see it, right? Why don't you see it? Well, you only see it when things move into it and turn invisible because the pattern producer isn't grabbing it. The pattern producer is just sort of taking surrounding material and using it as a Photoshop fill, right? Removing an X from a photo so that you can, put it on your profile. So I'll just clone some extra trees in here. I mean, that's basically what your mind is doing over top of your blind spot. And the same thing is true of sort of numerous other gaps in our perception. We have gaps in our perception, but we're not typically aware of those gaps in our perception. Our mind stretches to fill, right? It sort of, hits the clone button and stretches to fill. The same thing is true of other kinds of gaps, right? So, narrative gaps. if you, read haiku, right? Haiku as a form of poetry is predicated on, done right, a certain kind of gap. Two images, generally speaking, one sort of naturally inflected in close juxtaposition, and yes, 7 or 575. But the thing is the juxtaposition, and then your mind fills it in. Juxtaposition invites this. Why this, then that, right? Why this, then that? Your mind will seek to do so. It'll sort of make that inferential jump right away, because it's doing that all the time, right? It's forming correlations in your experience all the time. If two things happen together, then it's like, why are they happening together? If they're particular, why this, then that? The fact that two things follow after each other invites, right, this projection to fill in the gap. And that projection is in the form of inference. It's in the form of, right, a linked meaning, finding out how are these things how are these two things co-relevant? Are they two co-relevant? So the haiku does this very well. Image one, image two, but there's a gap. They're just in juxtaposition. So, and then your mind fills it. You can see that fundamental principle, right, in adaptations of the haiku. So I'm thinking here of Ezra Pound's poem, very haiku influenced. Say what you will about Ezra Pound, since I think he was pretty fascist, but this is a pretty good poem, which is called "In a Station of the Metro," and it goes, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." That's it. Now, I add, Ezra Pound cheats a little bit because he also gives it an evocative title, right? He locates it for us in a station in the metro. But nevertheless, he's giving us two images, which are not necessarily linked, right? On the face of them, there's no obvious, the face. In, at the surface, there's no reason to link these two things. What we do, we see two things, and what do? We immediately transfer between them. We fill the gap. Same thing. Constellations. We look into the sky, we see dots, but we don't see dots. We see shapes. And if our mind is really flexible, really mobile, then we can change those shapes. We can constellate and reconstellate. We can break things down. We can maybe even just be like, it is just dots. We might even be able to, in the modern condition, hold the idea those aren't even dots. In fact, what it is a million atom bombs, a million hydrogen bombs exploding every second, unfathomably far away for an inconceivably long period of time. But it looks like a dot. I mean, that is what it is, right? It's a million, in many cases more, because our star is not particularly big. But, a million hydrogen bombs a second exploding is what it actually is. But anyway, it's a dot, right? But we don't see a dot. We see bulls and lions and snakes and Orion, Bowman, right? We see water bearers. We see all this stuff, right? We create lines where there aren't lines. We connect the dots, right? We project in this way. And the task at some level, right, is when we're talking about this stuff, and for our particular purposes, talking about projection, that to be able to separate out the distinction between sort of what's there and what is being added tells us about the source. It tells us about the origin, right? So we have to, like the instruction on the subway, mind the gap. We have to mind the gap. You can think about this in even starker terms, right? Think about, flotation tanks, what we used to call sensory deprivation tanks, but flotation tanks, I think, is a little friendlier on the PR side. Now think about flotation tanks, or in a slightly more punitive and sinister frame, think about solitary confinement. Under those conditions, people begin to dissociate and they start to hallucinate wildly, right? I mean, that that's a big part of it. They start to hallucinate pretty wildly, have visions. They experience other kinds of altered states that can be quite intense, quite intense. But what's happening there? Well, where is that? It's not in the tank, right? It's not in the bare white cinder block room that the cot is in the penitentiary. It's coming from them. They don't necessarily experience it as coming from them, as I've mentioned, right? I was quite struck by my own experience with flotation the first time that I did it, to experience pretty finely the moment where it was in my head, and I knew it was in my head, and then I started to feel it melt. And as the boundary melted, it started to be out there, right? I felt the turn. I have a lot of practice in this kind of thing. This is the sort of thing I pay very close attention to. Likewise, it's interesting, since the pandemic began, the change in my schedule and the requirement not to be moving around the city so much means that there are necessarily gaps in my day where I can take naps, if I'm lucky, right? I can take naps. And I have been practicing an ultra short form of nap, actually. I've been practicing the 10-minute nap. I'd always heard that the optimum length of a nap was 90 minutes or 20 minutes. 90 minutes because you basically get through one full sleep cycle, but 20 minutes because you can capture most of the primary benefits of REM without dropping into deep sleep. So you can wake up after 20 minutes feeling quite refreshed, right? You can get about 4 hours out of that. This is the basis of like the Ironman or Uberman sleep schedule that Thomas Edison used, right? Has been, periodically popularized by people. So you're awake for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and then you sleep for 20, and then you're awake for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and you sleep for 20, and then you're awake for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and you sleep for 20, and so on and so forth. I've always wanted to do this. It's apparently hell on earth. I think I talked about this a little bit in the first semester. It's apparently hell on earth. I've always wanted to do it. And not because it's hell on earth, but because I'm interested to experience the change in time perception and the extra, like apparently you end up with so much extra time, right? Because you're awake like 21 hours a day. So anyway, so long story short, right? I'd always heard 90 minutes or 20 minutes. But instead, more recently, there seems to be some evidence increasing that you can actually get most of the benefit out of 10 minutes. That's like down, 10 minutes up. Now, typically, I'm actually programming 15 because I'm giving myself a few minutes to like shut down the wheel and sink into it, and it's interesting. I mean, it is very refreshing. But the consequence of this, if you're trying to figure out why the hell I'm talking about this relative to what we're talking about, is that I'm passing across the threshold of sleep like 3 times as often as I normally would. Because if I take a couple of these things during the day, and I'm often a little short on sleep, and I take a couple of naps during the day if I can, right? If I can grab 15 minutes. I'm passing across the threshold of sleep over and over, but it's not in the same sort of crashing depth as it might be with my night sleep. I'm a little awaker. And so I'm spending a lot of time hovering within this threshold of consciousness. I'm getting a lot of opportunities to watch the transition of my consciousness as it moves into the state of dream, right? I'm getting to watch it. And in some cases, right, because I'm having a little trouble dipping into the nap, I'm sort of surfing along on it. I'm surfing in and out. It's sort of hypnagogic. I can pick it up and then in and out and in and out and in and out. This is the sort of thing, incidentally, that often happens if you're doing a lot of lucid dream practice or lucid dream meditation, something that we will talk about in a few lectures. In any event, the point is, when I'm surfing in and out of it, it's very much like this sensory deprivation. It's very much like the flotation tech. There is a turning outwards, right? And that coincides with what? It coincides with a blocking of sensory input. Not a complete blocking, because noises will be incorporated into your dream, and to some extent light stimuli will too. That's how the new lucid dream technology has worked. I mean, it's been around since the late 70s now, but the commercially available stuff. I'll show one of my toys. I have a few of these things now. It's an awesome paper. Sorry, as a quick sideline, but I am going to talk about this in a couple of weeks. Somebody sent me an awesome paper about real-time communication to lucid dreamers, which is astounding, like two-way real-time communication, lucid dreamers, amazing stuff. Anywho, the point is that I'm getting to experience that unfolding moment when my own senses close off and the mind blossoms to fill the space. That is what we're looking at when we're looking at projection, right? That's what we're looking at. So this projection, the projection into the image, is, as I pointed out in lots of places in this course, quite central. It's one of the central mechanisms that one uses to understand what's going on in the head. Because in the same way as, Dunning-Kruger is, of course, supposed to be a human universal. And the way that this information unfolds into the gap, the patterns and the way that it unfolds also are not completely unique. There's things that you see repeated, right? Things that you see repeated. And this is a great deal of what you're mining for somebody's archetypal material. It's what you're, right, mining to find their complexes. When somebody just fills up the space, if you know how to look at that, it's relatively, right? It's relatively not obvious, but it's relatively accessible, right? With a certain degree of interpretation to be able to bring stuff out. In some cases, it's quite blunt, actually. In some cases, it's so blunt that when you start getting into the practice of sort of doing this kind of stuff, often it's the case that as a client is telling you, something in this area, they'll suddenly, of course, have you internalized. And before you even say anything, they'll start laughing. And you'll instantly, of course, both know what it is that you're laughing about, right? Like, oh, this is right? You have a sort of a shared sense of, oh my God, this is this kind of thing that relates to that. That's after you've been doing it for a while. So it's one of the main ways that you look. And again, I started out from the position of Dunning-Kruger and somebody else because it's always easier to see this when it's somebody else. But consider likewise those instances in your life when you have held complex and maybe strongly worded opinions about things that it turns out you didn't know anything about. You didn't know what you were talking about. Didn't feel that way though. You felt like you knew plenty. If you sort of search yourself, you will find that there are, I imagine, lots of these cases. Now, in some cases, those are sort of, obvious to us, and we experience a kind of mild embarrassment, right? It's like, a classic version of this is we're just so scared of something, right? We're so scared of it. And then finally we get there. We're in a state of abject terror, and we get there and it's not what we expected at all. And then it's like, well, what are you so afraid of? And it's like, well, I don't know. It wasn't what I thought it would be, right? And then, of course, the question is, well, what did you think it would be? And where's that coming from? Because you didn't know what it was. So you were wrong. You either had bad information or you were just filling the space up. I imagined it would be like this, right? Like Mark Hogenkamp, when he goes to the art show, right? He's got some idea about New York. That idea about New York isn't New York. It's Mark. It's Mark. I thought it would be full of artists and freaks, but it's just regular people, right? This is New York as Oz. It's New York as, Shangri-La. It's New York as the promised land, right? The land of freaks and geeks. That's Mark, not New York, right? So it's easy to see this when it's other people because it's really stark. But when we turn it back on ourselves, it's harder to detect. Now, Jung himself talked about the kind of relationship to the soul image, okay, in terms of these projections. But let's be clear about what his specific aim was. He noted that the image projected outwards, but that wasn't meant to be how it stayed. That's not what he wanted. Over and over again in his life, right, he began to detect in his interior psychology, right, in his dreams, etc., these powerful, right, magical female figures. But generally speaking, what happened, of course, was that he encountered them in the world. That is to say that he would have these powerful surges of feeling about women, particular women, right? And biographically speaking, right, his entanglements with women were multiple and complex. He had a lot of deep relationships with women, but he also was very tangled with women, One does not need to read very far into his relationship with his wife and Tony Wolff, right? Who he sort of carried on a relationship with Tony Wolff, and it's fairly obvious at the outset that his wife was not happy about this. But at some point, she must have somewhat reconciled to it, because she and Tony Wolff continued to live together after he died. Like, they developed some kind of relationship and right around him. So complex stuff. But the point is, he began to realize that he was engaging in projection. This animal would jump out, he would, right, do what people do, move to possess the figure, the source of the magic, the source of the meaning, the source of life, the source of connection. He would seize it up, gather it up in his arms. He was a big guy, right? And then he would be gone. He would just have a mortal woman in a hole. And that hole, right, would be like, and then it would be out there again. And he figured this out. His process fundamentally was about trying to pull back the projection so that the anima stopped being something that was an image that projected and concretized onto people, and instead became a function, right? Became a function of inner relatedness. That was his purpose, to learn how to pull those projections back so that he could actually understand what it really was, an interior relation, something within him. That's the game, right? As he saw it. Now, I think that that's something that requires nuance and modification, because as I've pointed out, if you just start pulling back your projections without in any way sort of modulating it or having a consciousness about it, okay, then what happens is that you rob the world of magic. You disenchant it, right? You disenchant it. It's a kind of like, mythic gentling, right? Where you render it mundane, right? And mundane in a particularly bleak way a lot of the time, right? You take the magic out of it. You can do it. It's not hard. It's a stage that lots of people, it is actually hard. Let me qualify that. It is actually hard. But it is a stage that lots of people go through. And usually it's a stage that they go through after they've been burned in relationship a few times. And when I say burned, I don't mean that the other party like deliberately whatever, but just that they had a projection and it didn't go well and it hurt them, right? The state of affairs hurt them. Either their image projected and they couldn't have it, or their image projected and things didn't go well, or their image projected and then the image fled and they didn't end up with what they wanted, and they're disappointed and they're hurt. And they don't want to play ball anymore. They don't want to be jerked around anymore. I experienced this. More than once, quite strongly, right? I would feel that feeling, meet somebody, start to talk, realize that my mind was starting to orbit and think, crap, like I'm starting to fall for them. We know that feeling, most of us, right? Most of us know that feeling. And, there's a sense, I think, if you're sort of paying attention, that you can lean into it or you can lean away from it. There's some decision points, it's not typically completely unconscious past a certain point. It is for some people, but for many people, it's a case that you can kind of feel it. You can kind of make the decision. Sometimes people do that, when people decide to have like a summer fling, right? They kind of lean into it. There's like a tickle there. They're just like, I'm just going to go with it, right? And they allow it to elaborate. They allow it to project. They allow the magic to happen, even though they know that like, well, where is this? Maybe this is a contained thing, but whatever. I'm just going to let it happen. I'm going to give into the experience. So people do that, summer fling. I'll be interested to see, once immunization schedule comes far enough along, and I'm now hearing that they've apparently, I was hearing today at New College Council, they have apparently given the rubber stamp to some new vaccine here in Canada, and they're changing the Health Canada regulation in such a way as that there will be a gap between first and second dose, and so Apparently, word on the street is that they're talking about basically widespread or nearly complete vaccination by the end of June instead of September. So if that happens, get ready for a summer that's going to be full of flings. People are going to fling. They're going to fling themselves across the city. Is what's going to happen. It's going to be interesting. There are going to be some very loud parties, guaranteed. There are going to be some excellent concerts, and there are going to be a lot of flings. There's going to be hyper socialization, almost certainly. So, when you have that feeling where it's starting to tickle at you, and you lean in, that's leaning into the fling. But it's also the case that you can decide not to. If you get good at catching it, you can claw it back. I've talked about this before, right? It's like, no, nobody, no mortal shall have my magic. Thank you very much. I'm going to keep things mundane, and I'm not going to be led by the nose. Thank you, right? It's an attitude that people have. Some people stay there, right? And there are lots of ways to do it. People can run a certain kind of materialist, nihilist line on themselves, right? Well, it doesn't matter. Love's not real. And, we're just chemicals. We're biochemical machines. And so we're just driven to mate, and none of it means anything. And it's like, okay, yeah, like, sure, sort of. I mean, that's kind of true. But it's not clear to me, like, love isn't real. What does that mean exactly? Like, I don't know. If we believe that the Trojan War was even remotely a historical event, then love had, or lust in that case maybe, had sufficient force to launch 1,000 ships. So that seems real enough as a cause, right? I mean, it seems like things do occur. Nobody would argue that hatred doesn't cause events in the real world, or fear. Obviously, those things cause events in the real world. So what's not real about love? Well, it's not, the experience of it is not authentic. It's like, well, in what way? Like, how so? Well, it's just being driven by genes and hormones. It's like, so is digestion, but I eat food. What are you saying? My height is also driven by genes and hormones, but I'm still this tall. It's like, well, but your subjective experience of it is, it's imaginal. That's what you mean. I see. So, right, that pullback from the projection, people could do it, and they could be like, right, that's a full pullback. I refuse to allow my imaginal space to participate in this anyway. I'm not giving over my magic. The problem with that, of course, is it disenchants the world, right? Is it better to live in a dead world? Well, better that than disappointment, I guess. But, perhaps there's the third way. You can get good at magic. So there is this possibility of clawing it back. And doing that in a naive way, I think, is, as I said, it's stultifying and problematic. But at some level, right, one does want to do it. One does want to do it, right? And you'll see how, this is kind of contingent on experience. This is one of these things where, I've said that it has been, frankly, to my begrudging chagrin, that I've come to this conclusion over the years, that there are indeed certain phenomenological forms that require time in a way that is sort of inescapable. Now, theoretically, I suppose one could have enough relationships in a short period of time to achieve this state by the age of 20, right? One could fall in love and fall out of love, or be disappointed, and, right? Theoretically, you could do it. But, if you have had experiences of this kind, if you're sort of aromantic or asexual or both, you may not have this experience in the same way. In which case, what I would say instead is, like, consider this in terms of friendship, because it's not a dissimilar space. That's why we have concepts like the bromance and so on and so forth, right? There can be a kind of surging draw that comes with a powerful new friendship. You've all had it, that, like, right? Again, the mutually accelerating disclosure of a powerful new friendship, or the idealization of a powerful new friendship. It can be very much in the same space, right? so you can think of it in those terms if you happen to be aromantic or asexual or both. But, if you're not, think about your earliest memories around this stuff. And when I say your earliest, like really dig deep, as far back as you can go. Think about your earliest memories around sexuality. Hopefully they are not traumatic and unpleasant. Think about your earliest positive memories. Think about your earliest positive voluntary memories in this space, right? Such as you have them. Or think about the first person that you ever had a crush on. Can you remember that person? Like, do you remember? Or what's the earliest person that you can put a name to, a face to, you had a crush on? I can tell you right now, the answer is Nicole Delaney. Nicole Delaney, 5. This is the girl who I've mentioned, right? My sister listened in on my call when I got permission from my parents to phone her. And I called her up and talked to her mom and was like, can I talk to Nicole? Which is weird because 5-year-olds don't use the phone. We're talking about the early 80s here. At which point I asked her if I could interest her in orange juice and conversation. Suave, being a smoothie, orange juice and conversation. The sophisticated 5-year-old. Nicole Delaney. And I've also mentioned that Nicole Delaney cropped up later in a funny little constellation, right, of anima material that I turned up, which I'll touch back on later. But roll back your own clock. Who's the earliest person you had a crush on? Ignore sexuality for a second. Who's the earliest person you had a crush on, right? The earliest person you had a crush on. Who's somebody later that you had a crush on? Were you the kind of kid that had a lot of crushes? Not many crushes? Did they catch you by surprise? Did they burn a secret hole in the back of your mind that you would not say? Did you send your friends with a note? Did you bring it up yourself? Were you successful? Were you embarrassed? Did you ick it? Ick, but secretly quite fancy? Did you, deliberately act mean to somebody because you fancied them and it was confusing? Did you tell your friends? Did you keep it from your friends? Did you tell your parents? Did you keep it from your parents? Okay, roll it forward a little more. What's the first longest crush you had? Not the one where it was like, oh, I really like this person, but the kind where it began to become a Wagnerian Sturm und Drang. The kind where it swelled up in your heart with just absolute crashing waves of joy and despair. The one where the fantasies really took off, where, you would catch yourself daydreaming about how you were going to sweep them away, build a tower, secret life. This is when our bus ends up on a desert island. Everyone else is dead, but you and I are going to make it together. When did that stuff start to come up? And how did it come up for you? Did it all seem hopeless? Were you highly invested in it? Did you enjoy engaging in those daydreams? Or did you flee from them? Did they jump you unawares? Did you dream about them? Okay. And then think about, if you have had one, your first relationship. And relationship, broadly construed, you could decide it can be the kind of thing that was in, name only, but the first relationship that you had. If you haven't had that experience or you haven't been interested in that experience, what about friendships that you've had? Really intense ones, right? Intense friendships that you've had. It's again, it's a very similar kind of thing. But think about the progression of what happened. And think about how unconscious it all was, because it was. Guaranteed, right? And at some point, unless you're in your first relationship, or your first relationship successfully lined up to become your final relationship, it does occasionally happen. It strikes me as something of a statistical anomaly rather than like a lightning bolt instance of true love, but it happens. It happens. People end up with their high school sweethearts, and by all appearances they have a happy marriage. I knew a couple like that when I was younger. had a thing for their daughter. So, yeah, think about it. And think about how this peeled things back for you. They weren't what you thought. And then you get hurt. And then you do it again, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. Maybe you're smart. Maybe you only do it a few times. Maybe you've done it a bunch. Maybe you did it once and then you wildly went in the other direction to compensate and that didn't quite work. Or maybe you essentially dated the same type of person repeatedly and after about the third time started to ask your friends, what the fuck is wrong with me? Or maybe it's the case that you're still very much wrapped up in a particular type. And like, think about your type. Think about the evolution of type. Think about the type of person who struck you as being like a dreamy match at 13. Who was a dreamy match at 13? What were they marked by? Innocence? Experience? What was attractive to you, right? What was attractive to you? Who was the secret lover or the secret friend that you craved after in your private moments? The one that you daydreamed after, the one that, when you're playing that game with the thing. For anyone who's done this, you know exactly what I'm doing. And for those who haven't, you have no idea what I'm doing. So we'll just assume that I'm doing a mudra. But the point is for, right, this thing, right? What were you hoping for? Right? What were you disappointed by? Is it the same thing you want now? Is what you wanted when you were 13 what you want now? What's the difference? Does it follow the rough track of Jung's sort of hypothetical progressions of animus and anima, right? So if you're hankering after, is it like first you wanted a willowy, fresh, innocent, unworldly, sweet, beautiful, virginal, right, girl, like Brooke Shields in, the Blue Lagoon, right? And then maybe it progressed. You wanted somebody who was what? Darker, more worldly, more pushy, more edgy, more sexual? Maybe not. Maybe you still very much want that, right? Or, you're looking for somebody who is what? Competent, driven, caring, strong, quiet, integrated, funny, talkative, tall. Maybe you had one kind of looks in mind before and a different kind later. I always think it's interesting to look at these magazines that are put out for sort of young teen girls because they're dominated by a certain kind of morphology. And as always, sort of golden era Simpsons nailed this when they used to have Lisa read a magazine called Non-Threatening Boys, right? Which would have pictures of Corey, who of course was a very non-threatening boy. And yeah, that's definitely a thing. I used to say, this drove my own nieces kind of crazy, but they did absorb it. It was interesting. So I used to share a theory with people that in any given boy band, there was always, a distribution of types, right? So that you could hit the widest possible demographic of attraction. And so there was always types, and then there was always, this feels so unfair, frankly, to certain people. So I was being kind of a jerk. But there's always an ape, right? There's always a bunch of things. There's like sweet boys, maybe like a little more dangerous boys, and like, classically like freakishly handsome boys that look like they've been chiseled out of some kind of translucent alabaster, right? And whatever, and like a slightly more creative, softer boy, maybe. And then there's an ape. And what I mean by that is there's like a dude who, is like borderline unibrowed, nothing against eyebrows. I think eyebrows can be very charming, actually. But, like a heavier browed, a hairier, like arm hair or something. This is like in sort of much more I don't know what, conventionally phenotypically hypermasculine. Let's say that, right? It's, you know, like one extra member of the group on which they sprinkle a generous portion of additional Y chromosome, right? And I always thought that was interesting, the appearance of an ape. Now, it's a little unfair, but I mean, you know, think about it a little bit, right? So for some reason, and I'm inviting your analysis, not literally, but of course by context I am. But for some reason, at some point when they were young, I shared this analysis with my nieces, who, initially speaking, were put off. I don't even remember who it was they liked at the time. What group it was that they sort of were interested in at the time. But then they absorbed it and they came back with it. And when the next group came back, I remember my younger niece going, oh, blah, 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 and the ape. Now, the interesting thing about this, I mean, I don't know, I probably did a disservice in terms of categorization. You know, if I was gonna, obviously I'm not probably ever gonna be in a boy band. I think I can accept that at this point in my career. I'm unlikely to be in a boy band. I think I can set that to one side of my CV. But like, let's say that I could, you know, in some way, you know, distill myself into whatever concentrate of me would be necessary to get into a boy band. I'd be an ape, right? Anyway, yeah. So, and certainly there are a set of traits there that, you know, lots of people end up finding quite attractive. There's a very like visceral masculinity to it that lots of people find quite attractive, right? So my point here is this: what you get sort of at one stage of your attractions and projections and fantasies is not necessarily what you're going to get later. Does this follow the strict theoretical progression that Jung lays out for the anima and the animus? Kind of it does. If you work with somebody over time, you definitely tend to see, right, a complexification. You start to see a complexification. What people look for in a partner becomes a very different thing. What you look for in your partner becomes a very different thing. And, you know, at some level, that almost necessarily tracks what's going on with their own relationship with this part. But remember, at some point, increasingly, pulling back that projection is about converting that projection from a series of discrete images in the world, and instead recognizing it as an interior function. That is the progression of the inner marriage. I told all of you the story about my good friend and analyst. He was my analyst, Bruce, and how for his, you know, 50th wedding anniversary, maybe it was his 40th. No, I think it was his 50th. He bought this ancient ring, this electrum ring, and then, you know, he had a stone put in it. What was the stone? The stone was a coprolith, fossilized, as he put it, fossilized dinosaur shit. That was the way that he put it. And he did this partly to celebrate his marriage to his wife, which had been around for a long time, but really it was importantly, it was about signaling his inner marriage. And last I checked, he in fact had the stone engraved with a symbol, and I have not had a chance to look at it closely since. So there was some kind of symbol carved into the stone, like he sort of progressed in this symbolic act. This is the notion that he has pulled back from personification to function. Now, this is captured in many ways in what Jung is talking about with the syzygy. Syzygy. It's such a great word. It looks great. It sounds good. It's highly multifunctional. It's one of these words like the word zeugma, 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 right? Zeugma isn't a word that you use a lot. It's, you know, kind of a $10 Scrabble word, but like when you have it on tap, it's such a good word for certain things. us, right? And beyond Scrabble, you know? So, Zeugma. So Zeugma, if you don't know, Zeugma is a figure of speech, and it's like a word that's sort of simultaneously acting in two different domains in a particular kind of way. So like, okay, like this sentence. She stained her honor and her dress, right? She stained her honor and her dress. So one staining event is occurring in two very different domains, and so stained is doing double duty in this particular kind of way, Zeugma. And certain things you can think of in this sense as zeugmatic. My favorite instance of this, okay, lots of magical language is zeugmatic. And my favorite instance of this is the magical piece of speech that a priest uses when they say, I now pronounce you man and wife. I now pronounce you man and wife. And why is that zeugmatic? It's zeugmatic because they're saying that it's the case. They're telling you that it's the case. They're telling the assembled guests that it's the case, right? But also, the act of speech is the thing that creates the state of affairs. Until they say those words, there is not a marriage. And once they say those words, there is a marriage, right? I now pronounce you man and wife. That is the key magical act of fusion. It is zeugmatic. And it is also syzygitic, I suppose. What a mouthful that is. See, syzygy is good. It's like S-Y-Z-Y-G-Y. I love that. It's weird how much I love it now that I think about it. But I just like it. It's got that triplication. Okay, so Syzygy. We know what it is from this astronomical perspective. We know that it has to do with this yoked state, this binding between male and female principles in the psyche. And we know that that elaborates out to general pairs of opposites, right? Oh, right. The sun is male and the moon is female. And so therefore day is male and night is female and gold is male and silver is female. It goes down the line. Now, obviously, right, concepts of gender are highly weaponized and very charged in today's situation. And when I say they're weaponized, I mean they've been weaponized historically, which is why people have bad feelings about them, right? And obviously it's a more complex situation than, you know, any kind of like extremely simple is going to convey. But also it is, in fact, a condition of experience. You know, when we look in the world, you know, we, you know, look at, you know, a field of animals or something, and we're like, there's a bull and there's a cow, right? We do, in fact, experience things in those terms, even if those categories are somewhat received. And of course, we do, as we have been lingering on, you know, to some depth, we do, of course, experience very typically a kind of primary post-sexual channel of this in mother and father, right? And, right? That coming to us, and lots of cultural variation, of course, and like lots of room for break, but there is something to this particular kind of convergence, right? This particular kind of convergence. So, you know, there's lots of different versions of this, but the Syzygy and the zeugma, I now pronounce the man and wife. There's a bond there, right? I have expressed to people on a few occasions that, you know, there's a difference between, you know, marriage and not marriage. And I'll ask people, it's like, so what do you think, right? What do you think the difference is? And they're like, well, you know, no. And, you know, this is highly variable. I don't know that you have to have a religious ceremony necessarily to be married. But if you conceive of somebody as a spouse, right, partner is the most common usage you get now. It's very interesting, right? Partner. You will get people saying husband, wife, spouse. You get partner a lot, right? Partner is sort of the relational Ms, right? It's like, I don't want to specify and I reject the category at some level, but I recognize that I'm required to have a prefix appellation, you know, and it sort of boils down the middle. So my friend Capel and I who are both fairly straight, used to, for a long period when we were sort of single but spending enormous amounts of time together and sort of attending events together and stuff, used to refer to ourselves, and I picked this up from him, but as we used to introduce each other as our heterosexual life partner. I forget where he picked that up from, but you know, this was something that we did for years. This is Capel, my heterosexual life partner. Something that we did a lot. This is the same period where I used to, when asked what I did for a living, say that I was self-unemployed, which you know, it's like a funny deflection kind of, but very often just confused people, which probably was the intent, to be honest. So yeah, so even if you're conceiving things in terms of sort of, you know, partnership or whatever, like what's the difference? And one of the differences that I point out that often seems to throw people is that I say, well, you know, one significant difference is that, you know, it seems to me when somebody is your spouse, you make them part of your family. Like that's the difference. You know, your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever is not really part of your family. If you're seeing somebody after a long time, it might be like they're part of the family, right? That's often a thing you see, you know, breakups. I've seen plenty of breakups where people, you know, were like, I don't want to lose the family. I don't want to lose touch with the family. Like I've really actually come to feel accepted and integrated in the family, and you know, I don't want to lose that. But right, they feel less strongly about staying in the core relationship. And there are even, frankly, lots of cases where people, you know, stay in touch. Like it's actually quite common for people's mothers to stay in touch with their first girlfriend. Like that seems to be a thing, or at least have a soft spot for her if they didn't hate her, right? To have sort of a soft spot in some ways. So I think that's somewhat, you know, kind of weirdly common. I think it also happens more often than people think that bond, you know, continues in the face of divorce. So my own mother never dropped the name Todd. And, you know, at this point, she's never going to. Technically, she and my father are not even divorced, actually. Something that confuses lawyers to no end. They keep telling them, like, you need to officially break this. The other person can get access to your shit. They did it to my dad a few years ago when he was breaking off his 27-year marriage to my stepmother. And they were like, you know, you really, on paper, you really need to work this out and officially get it, you know, go file the paperwork because technically your wife could go after. And my father was like, no, you don't understand. And my mother finds this equally hilarious. And so do I. The idea that my parents would go after each other's estates is inconceivable. It's, you know, if they did, that would indicate something was seriously wrong. Like it would indicate we would start looking for sort of signs of you know, like brain disease or something. Like it would be that kind of thing. The same cannot be said of all divorces, obviously. Some of them are quite acrimonious. But the point is, you know, my mother maintained a relationship with my father's family. She was close friends with my grandmother. She continued to come to family events and things. And as I've mentioned before, like that led, you know, she had a relatively still good relationship with my father. She therefore used to do things like come to Christmas. There were a bunch of years when we all had Christmas together. Joke at the hospital where they all worked was Bob's two wives, my father. Right. And likewise, you know, my mother, I, of course, went to my stepbrother's wedding. And my mother went because he knew my mother really well. And so people at the wedding, at his wedding, were asking, so who's this? And he would say, oh, this is my mom, speaking about his own mom. And then he'd be like, and sorry, who's this? And he'd be like, oh, this is my step sibling's mother. This is my stepdad's wife, right? Anyway, confusing for people. But the idea is, what's a spouse? You make them your family. I mean, in the, you know, the modern nuclear family age, you're having that off often, right? To form your own unit, they become your primary family. If you're having kids or whatever, right? It becomes your primary family, but you make them your family. That's the transition. You bring them into your family. This is much more obvious in many traditional cultures, right? There are certainly lots of cultures where like the wife leaves her family and goes to another family, at which point she is their theirs, right? So it's not even part of your family. And sometimes that actually breaks lines. I know a fair few people who feel really upset about the fact that, like, basically their fathers don't carry a relationship with them anymore, women, because they got married. And it's like, well, you're part of that family now. It's hard, right? So there is a specificity here. Now, Jung spent as much time and attention as he did on this very specific matter, this alignment of the sun and the moon and the earth, because of the special and particular weight that it played, obviously in his own experience, but also in the literature. When he looks at the Rosarium Philosophorium, right, which is a classic kind of alchemical text, you look at the panels of that text, right? There are various panels, and it's about alchemical transformation, much, I add, in the fashion of Anatomy of the Psyche. And maybe I'll scare up my copy of that, and we can go through it a bit next week. I can go through it panel by panel. That'd be kind of fun. So, you know, this starts with a king and queen, as so many of these things do. It starts with a king and queen, and it gradually moves through a set of, you know, principles, like most of these things, you know, baths, deaths, burials, burnings, you know, people being eaten by wolves and wolves being eaten by lions, lions being eaten by dragons. Like, you know, that's fairly standard stuff. But the point is, it goes through this whole set of transformations and burials and so on and so forth. And we start with a king and a queen, and we move towards this state of the rebus, towards the archetype of the androgyne, right? The androgyne. Now, androgynous has, it's funny, it's picked up a kind of negative connotation in English, right? Androgynous is, you know, if you say somebody is androgynous, it's not complimentary typically. It's said, it seemed to be damning with faint praise, right? Which is why my preference is for sort of hermaphroditic. And I often don't even say that. I often specify, right? I say mystical hermaphrodite. But the basic principle is kind of the same. It's not identical. And actually that specific shift, if you recall me talking about the dreams that I had about my own premature lesser conjunctio, right? My own false conjunctio experience, that when I felt that I was sort of integrating these things, but I had not yet developed my own masculinity sufficiently, and therefore had no business integrating at all, I would have these dreams about this straw-colored, very, all apologies to Tilda Swinton, but this very Tilda Swinton-esque kind of straw-colored, sinister figure that would be in these like beige suits. And that was the thing, right? It was a kind of forced neutrality that in its lack of development was vampiric. And that was, right? That was what turned up in my dream, was this sinister hermaphrodite, not hermaphrodite, sorry, this sinister androgyne who was, right, inviting people into my glass house and stuff. Turned up more than once. And meanwhile, the masculine principle, which had been completely exiled, was out on the water raging away because I hadn't let it in yet. But there is a fuller version of this, right? One separates this stuff out, which requires, of course, right? The development requires separation. You can't just go smashing things in together. It requires, to some extent, extremity and the power that extremity brings. So, you know, this was the process. And of course, the process I'm so very much going through, but an active process. This is what Rosarium gets at. I am, in fact, going, I think, yeah, you know what? Let's go through the Rosarium next week. I had considered looking at the Turba before, and I do, in fact, have time set aside, as it were, to go through. I mean, I can show you a little bit very quickly. I have time set aside, of course, Anatomy of the Psyche, which I really hope you're reading. I will give a full review, but I wasn't totally sure what the student presentation was going to do with it this week. I didn't want to put my foot into their pudding, as it were. That's not an expression. Anyway, and Mystery of the Cumultio, Edinger, also quite good. Sorry, this is my like recap reading. Black Sun, Stan Marlin, always excellent. And of course, also we'll be using the Hermetic Museum, Alchemy and Mysticism. The wonderful Taschen, always great because, of course, so many beautiful panels, illustrations, etc. I have some other ones that I will be using. This is a classic set, of course, right? You know, what is it? Lions and babies, and alchemical vessels, and so on and so forth. So you know what? We'll go through this. What the hell? Why not? I'll be reasonable and grab a bunch of images, and then I'll use this business where it comes up. I have seen that in people's presentations, and I have even done it myself in the past. I just don't often think in those terms. So we will examine that. But in the meantime, what am I meandering around today? Drill into your projection. The projection is at the heart of this whole thing. That's how you get at it. You can get at it with your dreams, you can get it with your active imagination, but your projections is where you locate this stuff. And locating this stuff, this specific thing, and the way that it functions in this area can unlock so much. That is why it is the specific focus of so much of this imagery, because contained within it is the life force. And, right? Other things matter, but it's very powerful. So think about some of the stuff, and not just what I, not just glibly as I'm going through the lecture, but like really think about your own patterns of projection and attraction. Like really think about it in terms of type and stuff. Sit down and think about it. What's there? What does this tell you? And start from what I've mentioned. Start from Dunning-Kruger, right? As just like, yes, this is a thing I've experienced, right? It's always easier to identify this stuff in other people. Then you start applying it back towards yourself. Then you start applying skills towards yourself, and you apply skills outwards. And eventually, right, you learn to be able to interact with the community within you at the same time as you are changing your interactions with the community outside of you. Okay. I will see you all shortly.